I've been looking forward to this one. This is the John Gray Rostrum. And this is maybe not quite what you'd expect from John Gray, but it's a great way for a lot more people to experience one of my absolute favorite custom makers, though this isn't quite a custom knife. So this is a knife that John Gray, first off, who's John Gray? So John Gray operates out of Eastern Pennsylvania, and he is truly one of the OG custom knife makers. Not like Bob Terzola OG, that's John Gray's logo right there, but he has been around for a very long time. He's been doing this for a very long time, and for a very long time, the only John Grays out there were customs, and his customs were expensive. He had some models like you've seen if you're familiar with Kaiser did a version of the Thuck, which is a big, thick, heavy Wharncliffe. There was also another knife I can't quite remember the name of right now, but his most well-known custom was his Blood Shark. That was a collaboration with Tracker Dan. He took Tracker Dan's relatively famous Blood Shark fixed blade design and made it into a folder. Now, the Blood Shark, this is not a Blood Shark, this is a Rostrum. The Blood Shark would be on my very short list of my favorite custom knives that I have ever handled. I owned 2 Blood Sharks at one point, and in particular, the titanium Blood Shark that I had was one of the most immaculately constructed knives that I ever had, with an insane grind. That thing had 160 thousandths blade stock. It came down to a hyper keen edge. I've had very few knives that have stock that thick that slice as well as that one did. It also disappeared in the pocket in a way that a knife that thick and robust shouldn't. It was an incredible knife that I just had to sell at that time. Blood Sharks these days regularly go for $1,500 to $2,000, if not more, and that's down from where they used to be. John Gray also does a lot of collaborations with Microtech, especially with Sebastian Borka. You've probably seen John Gray, you've seen this logo here in John Gray reground versions of various Microtech and Borka knives, including some John Gray Borka Stitch collabs that go for $4,000 or $5,000. For many, many years, when he was just making those customs, John Gray, part of his calling card was that everything was done by hand. All, hand milling, just moving, manually moving that mill around, hand sharpening, hand sanding, everything was done by hand. The Rostrum, I am 90% sure on this, and certainly based on the production volume that he is putting out with this and now his other model, the Slitter, and then he's also started putting some Thucks out again. His production level is far above what he ever was doing as a custom maker. He was kind of like Tom Mayo as a custom maker, where he put out a large couple handfuls of knives every single year. Now he is doing, it's not like regular drops, it's not like we're talking like McNeese levels of productions, but you're talking dozens of knives every quarter across various retailer shows, things like that. So that and other details of this lead me strongly to believe that this is a mid-tech knife. This is John Gray moving into the mid-tech space, where this, and honestly it looks like it when you look closely, it is almost certainly a machine-made handle with what I believe is probably still a John Gray hand-ground blade. That also means that the Rostrum, by John Gray standards, is a relatively accessibly priced knife. What do I mean by John Gray standards? I mean that this is a $900 knife, a $700 knife if you get very, very lucky, rather than a $1,500 to $2,000 knife. So we are still talking an extraordinarily expensive knife, a knife that is far beyond the price point that you ever need to get into. But if you really like these John Gray grinds, and as I'll talk about, there's a lot of reason to love these John Gray grinds, this is the cheapest opportunity you've ever had to get into that. And if you look at some of the stuff he's doing with the Slitter, which is his newer flipper model, I mean, the grinds on some of those are just absurd. So to get through some specs here, again, this Rostrum is about $900. You'll see various configurations. PVK has a bunch that are running for $1,200 right now. Some have titanium on the front scale, some have carbon fiber. I think those are the only two materials I've seen. I haven't seen a G10 or anything else like that. This is a frame lock. Lock side is always titanium. Sometimes this whole titanium side will have a barked texture on it. John Gray does a really, really good barked, like, little, looks like tree bark texture. For all I know, he might have even been the originator of that texture. This one is just basically stone-washed titanium. Similarly, they all have a titanium backspacer. Some of them have, hand-carved sort of divots and grooves into that. This one is just sleek and simple. That's a lot of those simplicities are the reasons that I chose this one. There's also a couple, if you want to get really ridiculous, that have a karambit ring out here, which is just a completely ridiculous thing. But John Gray has a sense of humor with his knives. And then this version here is his drop point version, which is a drop point with a very slight recurve to the back here, and a grind that goes all the way down to this terminating edge. You can also get versions in a Tonto that goes straight out to here and then just sort of angles down. And then he has what he calls his cockspur, which is basically a raised Warncliffe that goes straight up just like that. That one gets super, super pointy down at the tip. But obviously, you're losing a lot of this big belly here. So this is about as basic as a rostrum gets. And basic versions like this, you're talking $700 to $900, maybe up to $1,000, depending on the retailer. Higher and more spruced up versions can easily get, a little bit north of that $1,000 mark. This particular one weighs somewhere right around 3.3 ounces, 3.25 inch blade, 3 1/4, and the blade stock is just a little bit over 1/10 of an inch. So PVK has these blade stocks at 115 thousandths. One key difference with this rostrum compared to a lot of the John Gray knives you might know if you've ever been fortunate enough to handle one, this thing is on bearings, not washers, which I was a little disappointed to experience right when I first got it. John Gray does some extraordinarily good washer actions, but again, that suggests to me that he is probably trying to do these both to appeal to a slightly broader market. A lot of people just like bearings, but also to just be able to produce a little bit more of these without necessarily having to conform to the razor tight tolerances that you need to get a $1,000 action on washers. It's just a little bit easier to get a really, really good action on bearings than it is to do so on washers. So let's start with the grind here, because honestly, this is why you get a John Gray knife. You get a John Gray knife for the grind. He does some of the best grinds on the entire market. So we're starting from relatively reasonable. Actually, let's do a couple size comparisons here before I get into that. A little bit bigger than our native. It's a little bit bigger than our Para 3. Probably a smaller knife overall, but a little bit longer. I've got my Mac right here, so you can see a little bit bigger in every dimension than your 3-inch PM Mac 2. Again, compare it to your mini grip here. Quite a bit bigger than your mini grip. And then if I bring out a PM, oops, I'm hitting my camera all over the place today. Bring out your PM2 and you can see quite a bit, not quite a bit, just a little bit smaller than your PM2. Honestly, ends up feeling pretty similar in size to your PM2 here. So, back to the grind. John Gray starting from some pretty decently thin stock to begin with here. It looks in profile a little bit thinner than it is because there's a pretty sizable chamfer right here. So you got to sort of look at where the edges of that chamfer are. But still, it's sub 120 thousandths. You're decently thin stock here. But then what John Gray always does, this is a flat grind, but as with every John Gray knife I've handled, the dude goes aggressive on his grinds. And, he intentionally leaves those grind lines there to sort of show it off. This comes down about as thin behind the edge as any sort of, reasonably production scale knife. Frankly, it's about as thin behind the edge as any knife that I have handled, any folding knife that I have handled. You can see this is a 17-degree edge here, and you can see how thin, how small that bevel is there. It gets a little bit thicker toward the tip, just because there's not all that much space to drop because of the way that this grind goes all the way up. But this thing is super duper thin behind the edge, and in fact, with the about 20-degree per side edge that it's shipped with, this thing almost looked like a zero grind, in the sense that this primary bevel virtually almost went down to the edge here. And the fact is, properly sharpened, oh, and by the way, this blade is magna cut. I forgot to mention that. And it seems to be heat treated well. Maybe a tiny bit softer than I'd like, but it seems to be fine. This knife cuts just like you would expect for a knife that is that thin behind the edge. Now, you got a very interesting sort of drop point here, in the sense that it's a pretty high drop point where the belly is kind of pushed toward the front of the knife, and then you've got almost a flat here. This ends up, even though it's not technically a recurve, it ends up functioning a bit like a recurve in practice, because when you're dragging through stuff, you end up kind of pulling with the bottom of this little curve here. It's just a bit of a wonky looking drop point, and it is a drop point. There's a bit of a curve down toward the tip there. It functions like most drop points, albeit with that relatively high tip. So not very good for your utility cuts, for getting down on a table, scoring stuff or pulling through stuff. If you're like dragging through a box, you're probably going to use the bottom of this belly, not the tip, to do it. So a little bit ungainly for that stuff, but drop points, they're good general use blade shapes that do everything decently well. And this is no exception to that, but it does it with an extremely sharp grind. And as long as this thing is kept sharp at the edge, this is one of the sliciest knives that you are going to handle. And the only knives that I've handled that are even slicier than this one are things like, I don't have it with me, but this, for example, isn't quite as slicey as a well-sharpened Benchmade tagged out. And that's because that knife is just so thin at the spine and has a full flat grind on top of that. It just gets even thinner behind the edge than this does. The Spyderco Centofonte, that one, 90 thousandths on the blade stock with a hollow grind on top of that. That gets thinner behind the edge than this one. But for anything where basically the point of the knife is not to be a delicate super slicer, this is going to be as thin behind the edge and as slicey as anything that you are going to find. And this drop point blade here, blade shape, is probably the most generally useful form of rostrum that you are going to get. The only downside with this blade shape is if you don't have the right stones for it, meaning you don't have narrow stones, this part down here is definitely a bitch to sharpen, because your stones are going to have a hard time skating through that. And I will openly admit, I had a hard time sharpening the base of this blade here. My stones are a little bit narrow, but not quite narrow enough to make that easy. Now, other parts, so just very cool blade. And if you want a John Gray grind, it's maybe not quite as mind-blowingly good as what I had on my Blood Shark, but it's certainly up there, and it's certainly an elite grind. And it's one of those grinds where it's sort of like you understand what sharp means when you really handle a knife like this. And you realize that a lot of the knives that you thought were sharp weren't really as sharp as a sharp knife could be. Now, action. Action is one of the places that, admittedly, I've been a little bit disappointed with this knife. You've got two deployment methods. You've got a thumb stud, which I think is a TI connector stud here, and which I think has a Zerk inlay. And then you've got an opening hole here. Both are very nicely done. Very easy to actuate that thumb stud. Very easy to get into that opening hole. You've got both of them. Easy to actuate. Nice and just solid, consistent there. The problem is, this does have a tendency to get play introduced into it. I've owned 3 rostrums, and this has been the case with all 3 of them, so it's not particular to this one. Even when this pivot feels like it is properly tightened down, there's no play in this thing right now. But from time to time, this knife will develop just a little bit of, especially in the middle of the action here, it will develop just a little bit of slop. Now, it's centered nicely. When you close things up, everything is nicely flush, nicely put together. Those gaps are mostly where the chamfers are. There's not really a gap there, so to speak. But it's, there is just a little bit of slop in that pivot that develops from time to time. Now, I've always been able to get it out by just cranking the pivot down a little bit or cranking and loosening it a bit. Whatever it is, it just gets a little bit out of sorts from time to time. But it's part of the reason that I said I was disappointed. Disappointed is too strong a term, but it's not the wrong term. Disappointed that this thing was on bearings rather than washers. It's a solid action. It's good. It's not as immaculate as something like a Grimsmo or a Koenig, but it's a good bearings action. But part of what made, say, John Gray's Blood Shark so exceptional is that thing, despite being relatively thin in its construction, except for the big honking blade, that thing felt as robust, solid, and tank-like as any knife you're going to feel on the market. That was part of its calling card. This rostrum, just doesn't feel quite as tight. That is mostly an aesthetic thing. There are not really any functional issues. The lockup is good. I've never had any lock failures. Again, there's no play right now, and even the play that I had was only a little bit of left to right. It was play in the realm of not functional play, just a bit of play that you could feel that made it feel a little bit sloppier. But it is one of those things. This is still, even though it's cheap for John Gray, this is still a $900 knife. And feeling that kind of stuff on a $900 knife is a little disappointing. Not something that I've ever had be a real issue with this knife, in the sense that it's never been a problem. It's never felt unsafe. It's just a little disappointing. But then it brings us back to the handle, which this handle is very similar to the Blood Shark in this design. It's got this flared butt back here, and then some big scoops on the bottom, and then nice gradual swooping back here. This thing is fully contoured. This is some fat carbon here with some nice orange pops. Micro milling texture across the whole thing. Very nicely machined, and then your lock side is completely flat with nice big chamfers here. Machined pocket clip, sort of Emerson style design here. 3-hole design with a pretty tightly cut lock bar insert here. Looks like a decently sized gap, but that's because there's some pretty decent chamfers all around that lock bar cutout. One thing to note, John Gray does not use Chicago screws. He screws stuff straight into the titanium. Some people have an issue with that. Honestly, unless you are using this knife every single day, you're going to die before these things ever strip out. But it's just something to note. It's a bit of an old school design choice. The fact is, this handle, machining-wise, is very, very well done. It's very precise. Everything fits together very nicely. All the details are very good. There's nice little chamfers across the front, hard to see with carbon fiber. Everything's nicely knocked down. Everything fits together immaculately across the back, across the butt here. Everything's nice and parallel. And ergonomically, this is pretty darn good. This whole design with the flared butt, so this piece either goes right into your palm, or if you choke up a bit, it wraps around the back of your palm. This big flared butt here keeps your hands contained. This is a pretty secure grip. Just like the Blood Shark, this thing does not want to move in your hand, especially, either when you've got a contoured handle here, or there's some other versions where this is also flat. This side will also be flat. Ergonomically, I prefer those versions to these contoured ones, but even this contour one is still pretty good. Feels very secure in your hand without being uncomfortable. Pinches up pretty nicely when you want to get a little bit more precise. Lots of space to anchor your fingers back there. It's not, again, not quite as immaculately good as the Blood Shark handle, which is really just an ergonomically exceptional design, but it's very, very good, and it's more than enough to be useful. And as I like to talk about a lot, when your blade is as slicey as this one is, there's a lot less ergonomic demand placed on the handle. It doesn't need to be quite as ergonomically great, because you're never going to be facing nearly as much force trying to cut through stuff as you would if the blade was less slicing. One thing that is a little bit frustrating, this is a quibble, but the lock bar access is not great. thin blade stock here, so not that much space, and there's no cutout. So you really do have to jam your thumb in there, and the lock bar tension is definitely on the stiffer side. You do have to really jam your thumb in there to release that lock bar. It's something that you get used to, and the lock bar will loosen up a little bit over time. But certainly when you first get a rostrum, and again, this has been the case with all 3 rostrums I've owned, it feels a little stiff. It feels a little hard to access and disengage that lock bar. It's something you really have to look and be deliberate about. That's a quibble, and some people have an issue with that, some people don't. But all of that to say, this is a very cool knife. This is a very interesting knife, and it's very interesting to see John Gray go this direction. I really like to see John Gray go this direction with the rostrum, in the sense that this configuration, and this, what I again believe is a semi-production setup. I believe that this is a mid-tech, in that it's got a hand ground blade, probably machined to shape and then hand ground by John Gray, and a entirely machine made handle here. Especially because, things like that micro milling there, that you kind of see in the details there. I find it extremely hard to believe that kind of micro milling is hand done, not machine done. But if this allows John Gray to put out a lot more knives than he could otherwise, and to put it at what is for John Gray a more accessible price point, that's cool. That's great. And he's doing it with the slitter. He's doing it with a thuck. It's awesome, because John Gray gut grinds are something that every high-end knife enthusiast really should experience in one way or another. If you're somebody that plays in this $1,000 sort of range, you really do owe it to yourself to buy a knife from a maker that is known for doing really aggressive, really sharp grinds, to get an understanding of what a super sharp knife, what a really well-ground knife can really feel like, because it does kind of reset your expectations about what sharp means. But I will say, having owned multiple blood sharks, I like this knife in every way less than the blood shark. It is less interesting, it is less cool, it is less ergonomic. I like the blade design and blade execution less. It's just a less impressive knife overall. It doesn't have that rock solid feel that the blood shark has. It has a very impressive blade, but it's not the holy shit, this resets my expectation of what a blade could be like kind of blade. Because this is, this is a much better grind than you're going to find in most places, but it's a little better, because it's starting with thin stock and it's very slicey. But the blood shark, it feels like black magic how slicey that thing is at the edge. Kind of like the same experience if you've ever had a John Demko custom knife. If you have a Demko custom, sometimes you'll have his custom knives, especially his hollow ground customs, and you'll be like, this doesn't make sense how well this knife cuts. A blade that has stock this thick shouldn't cut as well as this does. The rostrum isn't at that level of performance. Instead, what you've got here is a very good knife, a very nicely designed knife, a knife that doesn't quite look like most other things on the market, that cuts very well, that has a relatively useful blade shape, that has a nice ergonomic handle design, that's very, very good. Now, the problem is it's still sitting at that basically $1,000 plus or minus $200 price point, which is, your same price point, not just the same price point as your Koenig, same price point as your Grimsmo, same price point as, your tippy top American-made knife manufacturers, and, going into the bottom end of true custom knives. And the fact is, for Grimsmo Norsemans are very, very expensive these days, but for a couple $100 more than this rostrum, and for, in some cases, based on the retailer, for about the same price as this rostrum, you can get in the Grimsmo Norseman, or in, some of Machine Wise's knives, or in, the SPK Lamia, or in all, a growing cadre of knives. You can get knives that are effectively perfect in their execution, that don't have any of those little quibbles like I had with a little bit of play, where everything is, jaw-droppingly tight, where your action is immaculate. And the execution of the rostrum just feels a half step, maybe a half step is too much, a tenth of a step behind those. It doesn't quite feel as great as some of those other $1,000 knives. So I sort of see this as if you're like me and you really, really like John Gray and you just can't get your hands on a blood shark right now and you want a way to experience John Gray, the Rostrum is a pretty good option. I would also say take a very good look at what he's doing with the splitter. His splitter, I think sometimes it's the slitter, his flipper version of this, which, some of what he's doing with skeletonization there and some of what he's doing with the grinds on that is absurd. You're getting knives with 4-inch blades that are like 1.8 ounces. They're probably scary sharp behind the edge. Some of those I feel like are probably really bringing the horsepower that I would expect out of John Gray and making knives that are truly exceptional in some particular way. This is a knife that just feels very, very good in every way. And if you're a collector and you like the way this looks, you like the way this feels, you like the materials, you like the maker, very, very good in every way might be worth $900 to you. But I do think that some people that, especially if it's a stretch for them to get to this $900 range, are going to be maybe a little bit underwhelmed when they handle a rostrum compared to some of the other stuff that they get. You are still getting a great grind, you're getting a great design, you're getting very nice ergonomics, but it's just not quite at that level of extra, at least in my experience, which is probably why I sold the previous 2 rostrums I've had, and I'm going to be selling this one as well eventually. At some point I'll get another blood shark probably, but that day will not be today. So that's the rostrum. Let me know what you think. Let me know if you've had an experience with the John Gray, or any of his knives in general, or if you've happened to have handled a rostrum. Let me know your opinion. Your experience might differ from mine. Let me know any other knives of this ilk that you'd like me to review. And have a good one. That's been it. Later.